Okay, test, we good? All right. Okay, so we're in Habakkuk chapter 2. So just a brief recap. So Habakkuk is a little bit different sort of prophetic book in that he doesn't say anything against God's people. It's kind of a conversation between God and the prophet, where the prophet stands on behalf of the people before God. The first two chapters, Habakkuk asks God questions, God responds, and so forth. And so what we got to at the end of chapter 1 is the second question. Let me back up for just a second. So this is at a time when Assyria is defeated. So all the prophets we were talking about before had to do with Assyria. Now Assyria is off the stage. They are no longer a country. Babylon has taken over, and so now Babylon is the major world power, and this would be right before Babylon would enter or invade Judah, but they are asserting their will in the area, and so the people of Judah are going to be feeling pressure that Babylon is going to be coming eventually for them as well. And so the second question that Habakkuk asked God last week, which is where we left off, is how could God use an extremely wicked country like Babylon to punish a less bad country like Judah? How does that make sense? And so Habakkuk is asking this question of God at the end of chapter 1. So then chapter 2 is God's response to that question. Okay, so the entirety of chapter 2 will be God's response to that. Okay, so chapter 2 starts with, it's Habakkuk talking. It says, "I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am corrected." So this is just Habakkuk basically saying, I've asked God this question, now I'm going to sit back and wait until God answers the question. So one thing you can take away from this verse is that the prophets did not have a direct line to God, okay? They might inquire of God something, but God would respond when God felt like responding, all right? So he would respond when the time was right for him to respond to them. It doesn't say how long Habakkuk had to wait for the response, but he didn't get the response just whenever he felt like he should get it. So God would give it to him when God felt the time was right. And that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind. So if you're not aware, there is sort of a modern day movement among some religious groups that I won't name specifically, that think they have modern day prophets in their groups. And they think that God talks to them and gives them messages on a potentially a semi-regularly basis. And that is not really what the Bible teaches with the prophets. The prophets couldn't just summon God to talk to them whenever they felt like it. So that's something to kind of keep in mind if you ever see on TV or YouTube, or you come across some of these guys that claim to be prophets today. Probably what they're claiming doesn't really match up with reality that you see in the Bible. So this is one thing to kind of check with that. Okay, so then verse 2, it says, "Then the Lord answered me and said," so now this is going to be God's response. Now the first part, this in verse 2, and maybe verse 3, it's hard to know if this is actually part of the vision or this is just God telling him what to do, and the vision actually starts at like verse 4. Doesn't really make a big difference, but anyway. So God starts off and he says, "Write the vision and make it plain on tablets that he may run who reads it." So what God is telling him to do is to write down what I'm going to tell you. And then he wants him to make it plain, Probably what he's telling him to do is put it somewhere in a public place where people can read it, okay? That's another thing modern day, quote, prophets don't do. They don't really write down what God says beforehand so that you can actually verify whether or not it comes true or not. So that's kind of a convenient step they tend to skip. So God tells him, write down what I'm about to tell you, put it in a public place, and then people can see it, and then when it comes true, they will know that I have spoken through you, basically, is the idea. The last line there is a little confusing. There's three possibilities on what it may mean. It says that he may run who reads it. It could mean one of these three things. It could mean that as you walk by, it's easy enough to read as you're just walking by quickly. So in other words, big letters, etc. It may mean some other type of just it's easy to read. Or it may mean that Habakkuk himself was supposed to go out and actually tell people what it says. It doesn't really make a big difference how you interpret it. But anyway, the point is that the message should be very clear and everybody should know what the message says. Okay, verse 3, it says, for the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it will speak and it will not lie. So in other words, what I'm going to tell you is going to happen. It will happen basically when I'm ready for it to happen. But when it says it will not lie, it means it will not fail. So it will come to pass in the appropriate time. It says, though it tarries, wait for it. So it's not going to occur immediately. So don't expect an immediate, for these events to occur immediately. But it says, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. So these things are going to happen eventually over time. Okay, so what's going to happen? So here's what's going to happen. All right, so remember, everything from this point forward is the answer to the question, how can you use a bad country like Babylon to punish a less bad group of people like Judah? And here comes the answer. Okay, so the rest of the chapter is the answer. Okay, verse 4, behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. Okay, so who do you think this is referencing here? So it says, behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by faith. Well, he's actually talking directly about Nebuchadnezzar here, okay? So he's talking about the king of Babylon, and so this kind of goes along with John's question, if you remember John from a week or two ago. How did John ask the question, if Assyria before them and now Babylon, if these kings of these countries and the countries themselves are a tool in God's hand, but they overstepped, how would they know, one, that they're a tool in God's hand, and then two, if they even did know they were a tool in God's hand, how would they know that they overstepped? And here's sort of the answer, okay? They were proud. Pride was their problem, okay? So they went way beyond anything any rational person would do, and it was because they were prideful. They thought they could get away with it, okay? And so a lot of what he's going to say here in this chapter, it all goes back to pride, okay? So what is usually the number one sin that people suffer from? Well, it's pride. So a lot of sins really come from pride. They have, different tentacles or approaches or way that it's manifested, but pride is really the primary issue. And it's pride in an attempt to elevate themselves above God or ignore God or dismiss God or whatever the case may be. So as you look at the verse, and this is an interesting verse, so let's kind of look at it a little bit slowly. It says, behold the proud. So in other words, look at Nebuchadnezzar, it basically is what he's saying. It says his soul is not upright in him. Okay, why is his soul not upright? Why is Nebuchadnezzar not an upright guy? Okay, well, it's kind of in the next line because it's a compare-contrast type thing. So it says, but the just shall live by his faith, or the ESV or some other translations say the righteous shall live by his faith, okay? So, what makes a person righteous? Or, well, what does the term righteous even mean? Well, you can say, well, it means rightness before God, and that's sort of true. But a righteous person is someone who lives by faith, okay? But what does it mean to live by faith? Well, it means you're obedient to God, okay? But it's more than just being obedient to God. I can obey all of God's commands with my heart not being in it whatsoever, okay? So it's obedience to God with a willing and right heart. In other words, it's someone who has a relationship with God and chooses to obey what God says because they love God, okay? That is a righteous person. Now, it doesn't mean they don't ever mess up, okay? But it means that the totality of their life and how they live their life is one in which they try to love God and try to do what God wants them to do because they love God, okay? You take that person and you compare that person to Nebuchadnezzar, and what does he do? Well, he doesn't do any of that, okay? So what does Nebuchadnezzar do? So as you're thinking about this individual, remember Nebuchadnezzar is in the known world that we're talking about now, the ancient Near East. He would be the most wealthy person in the whole world. He'd be the most powerful person in the whole world. He would have any and everything he wanted, from any type of debauchery to anything else he may want. He would have a harem, a large harem. He would have all the alcohol he wanted, all the power he wanted. He could kill anybody he wanted at any whim that he wanted. And he thought he could do any of that and all of that without any repercussions whatsoever, okay? So to answer John's question, what is his major problem? It's pride, okay? He thinks he can do whatever he wants to do without suffering any repercussions for it, okay? The contrast to that is the righteous person who lives by faith, they love God, and because they love God, they do what God asks of them to do, okay? So it's a compare and contrast between the two people. So with that in mind, we're going to see what happens to Nebuchadnezzar as opposed to the righteous person, okay? All right, so verse 5, it says, "Indeed, because he transgresses by wine." Now, I'll just tell you up front, this verse is hard to translate, and you get a lot of different swings on it, depending on what translation you look at. I'll just kind of tell you the gist in a second of what it's talking about. All right, but anyway, the New King James says, "Indeed, because he transgresses by wine, he is a proud man and does not stay at home, because he enlarges his desire as hell, and he is like death and cannot be satisfied. He gathers to himself all nations and heaps up for himself all peoples." All right, that's kind of convoluted. Let's just make it a little simpler. And depending on what translation you're looking at, you may be like, that ain't anything like what I just read. But anyway, so what it's getting at, the first two lines are particularly difficult to translate. Let me just check something real quick. Yeah, like the ESV, it starts off and it says, "Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest." What it's getting at here is, if you're Nebuchadnezzar and you have power and you feel like you have no repercussions, what are you going to do with that power? You're going to wield it, and you're going to wield it more and more and more and more, okay? What do people with no sense of God like to do with their vices? They go deeper and deeper and deeper into their vice, whether that's money or sexual temptations or whatever. You just keep going, because to get more pleasure off of it, you have to do more the next time and so forth. And that's kind of the gist of what this is getting at, okay? So when you look at line 3, when it says he does not stay at home because he enlarges his desire as hell, in other words, he's not going to just sit back at home and do nothing. He's going to keep trying to get more and more and more. Specifically, what it's talking about is him taking over more and more countries, okay? So he's trying to expand his territory, take over more kingdoms, bring them into his kingdom and so forth. That's the gist of what this is really going for. So then line 4, it says, because he enlarges his desire as hell, or you may have Sheol is probably another translation for this. So in other words, he is comparing him to Sheol, and then it's going to compare him to death in the next line. The idea is, in their way of thinking back then, is that Sheol liked to take up as many people into Sheol as it could. So it was kind of like a vacuum that tried to, pull as many people into it as possible. And that's kind of, he's describing his vices and temptations and everything kind of the same way. He just gives in to whatever, and he just takes more and more and more. The next line, and he is like death and cannot be satisfied. It's the same idea, but it's a kind of a play on words probably. So the Hebrew word for death is mot, but in Canaanite lore and in Ugaritic literature, there is a god named Mot, which is the god of the underworld. So all mythologies have a god of the underworld, right? So, you have to have a god of the underworld. So in Canaanite mythology, you have not that many gods and goddesses, but you've heard of some of them, like Baal and so forth. So one of Baal's brothers in Canaanite mythology is a guy named Mot, who is the god of the underworld. And so when you kind of think about it that way, these two lines kind of go together, where he's talking about Sheol, and then the next line he's talking about Mot, or death, or whatever. The idea is that, death likes to take in everybody, and it just takes in more and more and more over time. And so if you go to the last line there, it says, and he heaps up for himself all peoples. In other words, he's just taking over as many countries and people as he can. Okay, so what is he going to do with all that? All right, verse 6, it says, will not all these take up a proverb against him? So the more people he tries to accumulate and bring in as slaves or whatever the case may be, well, what's going to happen eventually? Well, what happens to all kingdoms that try to expand beyond really the limits of what they should expand to? It always falls apart eventually, right? This is what happens to all of them. So the question in verse 6, will not all these take up a proverb against him? In other words, it's going to eventually backfire, is the gist, okay? People aren't going to put up with it forever. People are going to start to revolt. So if you look at the next line, it says, and a taunting riddle against him, and say, woe to him. So the rest of the chapter is a bunch of woes, okay? So here's woe number 1. I think there's 5 woes total, if I remember right. So this is woe number 1. Woe to him who increases what is not his, how long, and to him who loads himself with many pledges. Then the next verse goes with it. I'll go ahead and read it. So it says, will not your creditors rise up suddenly? Will they not awaken who oppress you, and you will become their booty? So in other words, verse 6 starts off with a taunt. It's basically a taunt from the people that he has overtaken, and they're starting to mock him, basically. And then what it's talking about in this particular woe is that Babylon would sometimes lend money, okay? But what he's saying is, will not the people that you lend money to basically, try to overrun you because, you're lending it at exorbitant interest rates or whatever the case may be. In other words, this is just going to come back to bite you. And so that's what the first woe is about, is these people that you have loaned money to, it's going to come back and fall upon you. All right, verse 8, it says, because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the people shall plunder you. So the idea of what goes around comes around. You've been, terrorizing other people, you've been plundering them, you've been taking all their stuff. Eventually it's going to implode. it's going to come back upon you. The same thing's going to happen to you that you've been doing to everybody else. The middle of the verse there says, because of men's blood and the violence of the land and the city and all who dwell in it. So all the people that they have killed, all the violence that they have done, it's all going to come back upon him, okay? All right, so verse 9 is our second woe. This is specifically talking about him building his house and the city that he lives in Babylon. So the first woe is kind of about some political dealings he did. The second woe is about his personal house and city he's built. All right, so it says, woe to him who covets evil gain for his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of disaster. So what he did was he built a city, an extremely large city. Supposedly the outer wall was fixed 56 miles around the circumference of the city. And then he stuck his house right in the middle so that even if they were attacked, you couldn't get through the wall and then to the middle of the city to actually get to him. And so he felt like he was very safe and secure there, okay? And so that's what it's talking about in that verse 9. So then verse 10, you give shameful counsel to your house, cutting off many peoples and sin against your soul. So in other words, the idea is that you have built this with ill-gotten gains, and the result of all your actions is you're going to bring sin and retribution upon your whole country, okay? And then verse 11, for the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the timbers will answer it. This is a little confusing on the surface, but what he's talking about, so in Babylon, you don't really have a lot of wood and stone, so you would build with mud bricks. But that's not super fancy for a palace for a king, okay? So what Babylon did and what Nebuchadnezzar did, when they would go and conquer these other places, they would take stone and timber from there and bring it back home and build with it, okay, to make these elaborate buildings and palaces and so forth that they could not build with the natural resources from where they're actually located. So what would they do? Well, they would just plunder a lot of natural resources from other places, and they'd actually end up ruining a lot of those countries in the process because they would just strip it and take so much of it. And so, this is something they potentially did to Judah or would have done. It's going to mention Lebanon specifically in a minute, that they did that to Lebanon. So, Lebanon has the famous cedars and so forth, so they would have gone into Lebanon, taken a lot of the timber and so forth from Lebanon, taken it back to Babylon to use as building materials. And so that is against God's will to plunder a country like that of all of its natural resources for your own gain. And so God is basically saying, I am going to punish you for all this evil you have done. So another thing to kind of take away from this is God is not going to be mocked long term, okay? So God may not immediately react to a maniacal person trying to take over the world, such as perhaps maybe we see today, maybe. It won't last forever, okay? Now he's not going to intervene necessarily immediately. He will intervene when the time is right for him to intervene. But have you ever thought of some maniacal dictator who lived out their days in peace and quiet and passed it on to their children, and it lived as a long-term dynasty forever and ever and ever? Or does it always fall apart and it goes into the hands of some other maniacal dictator that tries to rule the world for a period of time? It's the same story over and over and over again. Okay, so the exact same thing that Babylon did to Assyria is going to then in turn happen to Babylon in not too short a period of time. Okay, so verse 12 says, this is woe 3 at this point. Woe to him who builds a town with bloodshed. So the previous section was specifically about Nebuchadnezzar's palace. The next one is going to be about, the city as a whole that he lives in. So it says, woe to him who builds a town with bloodshed, who establishes a city by iniquity. So what is he talking about here? Well, we already talked about where the building materials came from, which is they plundered other places and brought their natural resources there. So then who actually builds it once they get all the stuff there? Well, it's all the slaves from all the people that they've conquered, right? So you just bring these slaves in, you don't have to pay them anything, and you just work them till they die, okay? And then you just replace them with some more. So that's what it said. That's what it's talking about when it says, "Woe to him who builds a town with bloodshed." You've captured these people, you brought them in as slaves. You don't really even care if they live or die. They're just another resource to you to accomplish whatever you want to accomplish. So verse 13, it says, "Behold, it is not of the Lord of hosts that the peoples labor to feed the fire, and nations weary themselves in vain." What is he talking about here? So what God is saying is, this has not ever been part of my plan. There are multiple Old Testament scriptures we could look at, but we're not going to right now. But the idea is that God has made warnings in the past in Scripture that you are not to build a city with forced labor, okay? And if you do, that city will not last and it will be destroyed, okay? So what he is saying here in verse 13, it says, "Behold, this is not of the Lord of hosts." In other words, this is totally against my plan for humanity. This is not what I intended. So what's going to be the result of this? Line 2, "The peoples that labor to feed the fire." In other words, these people you have used as slave labor to feed the fire. In other words, feed the fire of his ego. And then the next line, it says, "The nations weary themselves in vain." So what he's saying is you have used these people to build your city, your temple, your house, whatever the case may be. But it's all in vain because it will not last, okay? God is basically just saying, I told humanity not to do it this way. You're doing it this way. So I'm just flat out telling you now, it's not going to last very long. I hope you enjoy it while it's there, but it's not going to last very long. I'll make sure that it gets destroyed, basically. All right, so verse 14, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." In other words, when Babylon goes down in flames, everybody's going to know it. Okay, and they're going to know that God was behind it, and they're going to know that God is the one true God, and that Babylon was an evil country that God destroyed. Okay, and that's the idea of verse 14. All right, verse 15 is our woe 4, I think, if I'm keeping track right. It says, "Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbor, pressing him to your bottle, even to make him drunk, that you may look on his nakedness." So what he's probably referring to here is not literal alcohol. What he's probably referring to is the idea of making them drunk with terror. So this would be referring to invading countries, terrorizing them, taking them captive, destroying the country, bringing them back to your place as slaves and slave labor and so forth. So he's issuing a woe against Nebuchadnezzar for terrorizing all these people, okay? So he says, "Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbor." In other words, you're giving this drink of terror. And it says you're pressing him to your bottle. In other words, you're forcing, it's like forcing somebody to drink. So he's forcing this upon them, to the point of making them drunk with terror, that you may look on his nakedness. So why is that last line there? Why is he terrorizing these people? Well, it's partly for his own gain, but it's also partly for his own amusement, okay? And that goes back to the pride thing again. If you think you can get away with anything, you'll try to get away with anything. And this is part of his sin, is that he thinks he can terrorize people for amusement purposes. And we're going to see in a second what God has to say about that. But it all goes back to his pride issue that he has, okay? And this is a common theme for dictators, well, a lot of political leaders. They don't have to be a dictator. Just a lot of people in any kind of power, they get drunk on pride and power, and they think they can do things that they really shouldn't be. All right, so verse 16, you are filled with the shame instead of glory. You also drink. So what, in other words, what's going to happen? So he's been terrorizing people. Well, that's all going to come back on him. Eventually, he is going to become the one who is terrorized for what he has done. So as you go on, the third line of 16, be exposed as uncircumcised. So as kind of a mocking way of saying, you know, you're not. Going back to the earlier line, you know, when he's comparing Nebuchadnezzar with the righteous that live by faith, you know, to call somebody uncircumcised, even though literally true in this case, also implies that they're not a righteous person before God, right? So it says, the next line, the cup of the Lord's right hand will be turned against you. Generally speaking, you don't want to drink the cup of God in this context, at least, okay? There are some contexts you do want to drink the cup of God, but this is not one of them. So he's basically saying, you've been making these people drink your drink of terror. Well, congratulations, I'm about to give you my version of the drink of terror, okay? Let's see, I lost my place. Okay, the last line of 16. And utter shame will be on your glory. So in other words, you know, all this stuff you've been doing to everybody else, it's all going to come back upon you, okay? Verse 17, for the violence done to Lebanon will cover you, and that's what I was talking about earlier. So when they went into Lebanon, they plundered a lot of the natural resources from Lebanon, or Lebanon. There's a place in Tennessee that we don't even pronounce it that way. But anyway, I'll just skip that part. If you're from Tennessee, you know how it's pronounced. So it's home of Cracker Barrel, nonetheless, if you're curious. Anyway, so he's saying that the violence done to Lebanon is going to come back on you. And the plunder of beasts which made them afraid. And what he's referring to is not only did they take the natural resources out of Lebanon, but they also did a lot of sport hunting when they were there. And that's what that's referencing when it's talking about the animals, that they took a lot of timber and other things, but they also killed a lot of the animals that were there just for kicks and giggles while they were there. So, you know, again, that's not part of God's plan either. So that was not a good thing. So then line 3 of 17, because of man's blood, and the violence of the land and the city and all of who dwell in it. So all this stuff that they have done to Lebanon and these other countries as well, it's all going to come back upon him, okay? Now, the last 3 verses, well, the next 2 verses, is going to go in a different direction, okay? It's going to start talking about idolatry, which he has not talked about at all up until this point. But it's sort of the last woe here. So, verse 18, what profit is the image that its maker should carve it? Now, we've heard similar language from another prophet, and some of the other prophets talk about it, but it's just sort of the humorous idea that a human could carve something that they make and then turn around and worship it as if there would be anything there to worship. Now, part of it is you have to understand their mentality about how idols work. It's not quite as simple as that. The way they thought idols worked is the human would, you know, make the idol and so forth, and then you'd have a little ceremony of some sort, and then that would summon part of the deity to go into the idol, okay? So it's not just that they carve it and then they think that's the end of the story and it magically becomes a god. So there is a little bit more to it than that, but still the idea holds true. Why in the world would you think that something that you made was deity? How could a human make deity? Okay, that makes zero sense. So it goes on to say, the molded image, a teacher of lies, that the maker of its mold should trust in it to make mute idols. Then verse 19, woe to him who says to wood, awake, to silent stone, arise, it shall teach. Behold, it's overlaid with gold and silver, yet in it there is no breath at all. And so what he's kind of mocking here is in Babylonian art, a lot of times when it pictures a god or an idol or something, it's laying down. So that's why he says awake, because normally they lay down, so they'd have to rise up before they actually would do anything. Of course, they can't rise up, they're not real. But that's the whole point. He's making fun of them. So he's saying, you know, you worship these gods, they're all fake. They're not gods at all. And so the point he's making is Nebuchadnezzar is going to find out who the one real God is. He worships these fake gods. But in the end, when all these things God is promising is going to happen actually do occur, he will come to the realization that his gods are powerless because they're fake, and there is only one real true God. Now, I think I mentioned this before, but his name, Nebuchadnezzar, I forget what the exact full name means off the top of my head, but the first part of the name, what we say is Nebu, it's in Akkadian, it's Nabu, and Nabu is one of their gods. So I'll probably get this wrong and confuse it with one of the other ones, but it may mean, and I could take the time to Google it, but I won't do it right now. At least one of them means Nabu, protect the gate. In other words, like protect the city. But that may not be what his name specifically means. But anyway, the idea is Nabu is the first part of his name, which is one of their gods. And so that's what this is talking about. You worship these gods that are fake. You're going to eventually find out that they are fake. Okay. So in contrast to all that, verse 20, but the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silence before him. And obviously that's probably the most famous verse from the whole book. We've all heard this verse before. So the contrast is you worship fake gods that aren't real, they're just man-made idols, whereas the real God, where is he? Well, he's in his holy temple, and eventually what should happen is the entire earth will be silent before him, and eventually it will all be silent before him. So does any of this actually ever come true? Well, yes, but Nebuchadnezzar has an extremely long reign as king. I forget off the top of my head how long. Don't hold me to this, but it's somewhere in the ballpark of 45 years, roughly. I can't remember exactly. He reigns for a long time. So it's not like what he's telling Habakkuk right now is going to happen tomorrow. Okay, it's going to be a while before all this starts to happen. But eventually it does all happen. Babylon is defeated by the Medes and the Persians. And so Assyria had a pretty long run as the big dog in the Middle East. Babylon has a very short run as the big dog. They are not the main power for, again, don't quote me on it, but somewhere from 612 when they beat Assyria down to, can't remember off the top of my head, let's just say roughly 550. I may be off by 10 to 15 years, but roughly. So you can see that it's somewhere between 50 and 70 years. It's not a real long run that they have as the major world power. So I'm going to stop there tonight, unless anybody has any questions or John. I figured. I had confidence John would come through to fill the void. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. No, that's good. One thing I forgot to point out, and I know that was the second bell. So verse 4, particularly the last line, that verse is quoted a bunch in the New Testament. So 3 different places: Romans 1:17, Galatians 3:11, Hebrews 10:38 through 39. So it appears multiple times in the New Testament. The wording is not necessarily exactly the same, because the New Testament is quoting from the Greek version, as opposed to what you read in Habakkuk is from the Hebrew version. So if you pull out those verses and set it side by side like this, it may not be word for word the same, but the thought is the same. So it does appear multiple times in the New Testament. I think that was the only other thing I was going to point out for tonight. Any other comments or questions real quick? All right. Good to see everybody. Hope you have a good week.